Welcome to Chapter 4. Now, we already left the pre-birth stuff behind us in the first couple of chapters, so now we're dealing with afterbirth. Um, I amuse myself sometimes. So one of the first things I want to go over for new stuff is they go over breastfeeding a lot in the book. And this is something that is very interesting culturally, and we'll get into culture a little bit more later on as well. As a matter of fact, when we talk about culture, first of all, we're talking about just this specific culture. We can't make bold assumptions about what they do in other cultures. This is the one that we're studying right now. Um, and breastfeeding is something that is very odd in our culture. The nomenclature itself surrounds it. Breastfeeding, and we call the milk breast milk, as if there's milk that comes from anything but a breast. We don't want to call it human milk because that would then sound weird, although that's completely just what it is. It's human milk. Um, they talk about classical conditioning and breastfeeding, how to teach people how to breastfeed. This is actually something that's kind of fascinating in our culture because we have this idea in this culture that breastfeeding is very hard, and we don't even realize that we have this. You go into a hospital, any of you that have had kids or even know somebody that's had kids, they go into a hospital and they just get slapped in the face with breastfeeding. Breastfeed your kids, breastfeed your kids. It really gets shoved down our throats, instead of the baby's throat, appropriately enough. Um, and at the same time, while we're trying to encourage breastfeeding, we're also making it sound very frightening. You go into a hospital and they have something called a lactation consultant. I can't even make this up. This is literally a trained professional paid $50,000 a year to tell people how to breastfeed. Now, breastfeeding is not a difficult thing. If it was, we would not have evolved without lactation consultants. And these are fairly new things on an evolutionary scale. We had some midwives, and the midwife basically just said, yeah, put the baby up to your breast and it figures it out. Because it does. Um, it sometimes takes a couple of days to the baby and the mother to work things out, but it's fine. I mean, we're made so that is fine. This actually gets us into our first delving into instincts. Now, instincts are vastly different from uh, any learned behavior because instincts are inborn. They don't need to be taught. Uh, they're instinctual. And when a baby is born, there's actually only a few different things that it definitely knows how to do. It knows something called root, which is you put anything on its cheek and it'll turn to it. That's called the rooting response. The next response that it has is the sucking response. Obviously, root and suck go together. You put the baby even near the breast, and it's going to turn and then suck. Obviously, without these two, we wouldn't have made it very far. Oddly enough, the third instinct is one where when you drop a baby, don't try this at home, kids, but when you drop a baby, the very first thing it does is it flails its arms out, and then about half a second later, it curls up into a fetal position. And that sounds really weird, but again, it's one of these evolutionary things where if you drop a baby a very short distance, it's better to be splayed out so it can catch itself. But if you drop at a decent height, it's actually better if it's all curled up in a ball. Babies bounce, I guess, like bumbles. So together, this makes it so that when you drop a baby, it goes whoom, like it's kind of strange. Um, Again, you can just anybody that has babies does this. By the way, they notice that when you throw a baby into the air, you know the drunk uncle thing to do. You throw the baby into the air. The first thing the baby does, it goes ah, but then by the time it lands, it's curled up, which makes it harder to catch. By the way, it'd be far easier if they did this the whole time. You just catch their chest and it'd be easier. Hence why nobody wants drunk uncles to throw their babies. Um, Now, as far as, again, talking about breastfeeding, breastfeeding is a very common practice. It's probably the most common practice, again, worldwide. It's the most common practice worldwide. Relatively abnormal to feed a child formula. It's kind of a privileged American option. Um, Formula, for those that haven't had kids, relatively expensive, kind of cost prohibitive. We kind of give free formula to poor people here, so it's not as much of a problem here. You can either afford it or it gets given to you for free. Um, but at the same time, it's also better for the child. And I mention this again, not to shove breastfeeding down anybody's throat, because that's actually one of the reasons people kind of rebel against it. They see breastfeeding and say, oh, you should breastfeed, you should breastfeed, you should breastfeed. And their first thought is, well, I guess if there's this much advertising on it, most people don't. And instinctually they're going, well, I want to be like most people, so then they don't either. The advertising should just talk about how normal it is and how or how freakish it is to do bottle feeding, and then that would make people breastfeed a lot more. But but the fact is, it is a lot better it's a lot better for the baby. It increases intelligence, and they have a whole thing in the book about all the different advantages that you have for breastfeeding. And it's a really good example of the fact that in this culture, we like to think that every type of parenting is okay. And, you can't tell me how to raise my child, that sort of thing. And first of all, it is okay to raise your child any way you want to, but it's not okay to deny the obvious consequences or the consequences found out through science of those actions. Um, if you beat your kid every single day, your kid will be messed up, or more messed up than they otherwise would be. We'll get into punishment later on, just as a sneak peek. Physical punishment like spanking a child actually works really, really well as long as you follow 7 rules. But not doing it that often would be one of the rules. That's why I say people that hit their children every day, because they're just flat out not doing it right. They're not doing it effectively. And that will have consequences. Not breastfeeding your child will have consequences. Smoking in front of your child will lead them to be more likely to smoke. Being obese will lead your child more likely to die an early death of obesity himself or herself. So there are these consequences, and we don't want to get to the assumption that all child rearing practices are the same, because they're really not. But again, we're talking about statistics. And statistics, one of the kind of neat things about statistics and why statistics aren't greatly understood, should have gotten into this a little bit more in the sciencey chapters in chapter 1, is that statistics don't apply to an individual. And this is really important. So if you're walking down the street and you know that in that area, 25, or let's say 75% of all black men are criminals in this area, and a black man standing in front of you right now, what's the chance that he's a criminal? There is no chance. Literally zero. There is no probability, because that person either is a criminal or they are not a criminal. That statistic is totally meaningless for this person. And statistics are totally meaningless for you as well. It could lead to more likely scenarios in masses of people, but ultimately you don't know what is going to affect this particular child. You just gotta kind of take your chances. So if and the reason I mention this is because I'm starting to get into statistics now, and I mentioned things like breastfeeding is linked to higher intelligence rates. Well, the first thing that goes through most people's mind is, well, I wasn't breastfed and I'm smart. It's like, well, fine, you may be. Maybe it didn't affect you. Maybe it did, and you don't know how much smarter you would have been while having all these other factors. These are just contributing agents. We'll also talk about, especially later on, how certain types of parents rear children differently. For example, breastfeeding really predominant in wealthy environments. And again, this isn't because of, again, the stereotype, which is breastfeeding is hard or breastfeeding is overly time consuming. You know what? Babies are overly time consuming. It's really not that much of a stretch, even in today's modern world, to simply breast pump, put it in a bottle, feed the baby the milk later on. It has all the nutrition and advantages. And you can carry a little breast pump in your purse. It's really not that difficult, but we're told that it is. this gets us into something called homeostasis. Definitely write down homeostasis. Live it, learn it, love it. Homeostasis is the idea that you will adapt to whatever your environment happens to be. Sometimes you'll adapt in a very healthy way, sometimes you'll adapt in a non-healthy way. So, and this is something that our bodies do, animals' bodies do it, everybody does this. So if you go jogging every single day, your body will adapt to being a jogger. You'll be able to run faster and have more endurance. All that cardio kicks in. You'll be able to outrun the zombies when the zombie apocalypse comes. And that's part of homeostasis. At the same time, if you adapt to scarring is an amount of homeostasis. That's why scars are tougher. Um, and you can adapt to other things too, not necessarily in a good way. If you grew up in a smoking environment, you're far more likely to develop asthma, especially if the smoke is pot smoke, because that stuff is really, really bad for you, as we'll get into later on. Just the carcinogenic effects are astronomical compared to tobacco. And so you have very high likelihood of asthma if you're surrounded by that sort of thing. And this is your body adapting, but not necessarily in a good way. And we'll talk about homeostasis throughout the entire semester because it's a really important concept. Now, page 106, not new stuff, stuff that's in the book now. Page 106 has table 4.2. This goes over. This is good to know. This goes over different ages that you're going to be when different milestones are as a baby, like when you first learn to walk, first learn to talk, that sort of stuff. Now, one of the things that I want you to concentrate on here is, again, this isn't how most parents think of this. Most parents think that, my baby walked when he was 9 months old instead of a year. We're told a year, so my baby must be really smart. Well, most of the time when you're told what babies do in development, it's kind of vague. Babies learn to walk between 9 and 14 months. So if your baby learns to walk in 9 months, that's fine. He's not particularly smart. He's not particularly stupid. He's just a baby. Humans vary. If humans didn't vary, I'd be out of a job. So you'll see the age range in which 90% of infants get that in that point. And the important thing to notice here as well is that just because you're slow in one particular milestone doesn't mean you're going to be slow in others. And this goes for everything. I mean, if you've ever met somebody who was really slow as a kid and then picked up and was really bright as an adult, that can happen. Heck, personally, I didn't even roll over until 8 months, which is really, really beyond the norm there. But then by 9 months, I was walking. I never had a crawling phase. I just rolled over and I got up, basically. And this goes for all developmental milestones, even ones as less significant as things like walking and talking, where if you've ever met a cute kid that turned out to be kind of an ugly adult, I mean, it can happen, and you can get some ugly kids that can turn into very, very attractive adults. One stage does not necessarily predict the next. Perception is another thing to talk about here. Babies perceive really well. This is something that we have the perception that babies can't perceive. Everybody knows that, well, when babies are born, their eyesight is kind of crappy, and that's true. They are, and that lasts 2 or 3 days, and then they're fine. People really over exaggerate exactly how bad their perception are. They are still learning to use their bodies, learning to use their eyes and everything. They've never needed to use their eyes, so it takes a few days for them to get in focus. But they're not exactly blind at birth either. They could basically see like somebody with really poor eyesight. Speaking of eyesight, by the way, that is one of the I wanted to re-mention this with homeostasis. One of the prevailing theories, by the way, with why so many people have glasses now compared to, I mean, it doesn't really make sense evolutionarily. evolved so that 50% of our population can't see worth a damn doesn't make a lot of sense. Homeostasis is one of the prevailing theories as to why so many people have eye problems, because in this culture we give people eyeglasses when they're still growing. So you might get a kid who's like 11, 12 years old. He can't see very well, so we take him into the doctors, we give him eyeglasses, and then we let him grow up with eyeglasses on his face. Now, there's a decent chance that, him having bad vision, his eyes are growing, his head is growing. This could have just been a phase, just something his body was adapting to, and he would have gotten better vision later on. But now that we have eyeglasses on him, that is his new environment. He will adapt to this. His eyes won't grow as well. Most of the people that have their eyes change a lot during the course of their life, their eyes continue to get worse and worse and worse and worse. They have a tendency to, they grew up with eyeglasses. So in an interesting way where homeostasis can affect us, and not necessarily in a good way. Another thing babies do with perception is up until about 2 months, they like anything that moves. They can really detect movement very, very well. And oddly enough, we like to say that babies can't see very well, but then we say, oh, but he can recognize the mother. Again, look at that chart. They can't actually recognize the mother until about 2 months old. They can't tell the difference. They don't even care for faces before that. You can show them a stuffed animal, a bunch of squiggly lines or faces, and they really don't care. They haven't learned to discriminate things yet. Okay, definitely something to learn is page 107. A great talk about culture. And again, we'll talk about culture all semester long until we're tired of it. Now, one of the things we need to understand with the amazing ways that culture affects us, and it does, in ways that people think are just instinctual. They think, no, this is how it is. And then we'll find out, no, actually, we were just taught that, and we were told that. One of the classic example that I use is usually pedophilia. We are told that pedophilia is bad and wrong. And yet, pretty much every culture in history had it as a kind of a normal and accepted thing. So, and then that's a very cultural thing. And I'm not condoning pedophilia in any way whatsoever. I'm just saying that culturally speaking, I'm looking at culture, not just, okay, I should probably define culture a little bit. A culture is just a set of norms in a society, just accepted values and things that are considered normal. But keep in mind, and when people use the word subculture, they don't really know what they're talking about. There's no such thing as a subculture. Surfers are their own culture. They have a different set of norms, a different method of communicating, really different everything. And culture is very chronologically based. We are a different culture now than we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So if you look at culture in that respect, there have been just millions of cultures because our own, just look at, say, Christianity. Christianity has differed widely as a culture between now and 2,000 years ago. They had very little in common with how they were 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 600 years ago, 100 years ago. It keeps changing drastically, and that's fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. That's just how cultures work. So if you look at all the vast numbers of cultures throughout history, they've changed quite a bit, in this case on something like how you should treat children sexually. To the point where now we're very puritanical. We don't even want to discuss children's sexuality. Children can't talk about their genitals. They can't mention my vagina itches. They'll get sent to Child Protective Services if they mention something like that. You can't even mention that you have a body part now. We're afraid of children's genitals at this point in society. Who knows how it'll be in 100, 200 years. But these things are very cultural, and it's interesting to look at it from that perspective, not necessarily a right or wrong thing. And this is why we need to look at research and actually understand it. I'd actually encourage everybody, and we'll be doing this for our projects later on, but if you have any questions on how something works, if you think you knew how it worked, go to Google and type in the word scholar, and the first thing that'll pop up is something called Google Scholar. This is one of the largest databases in the world of published scientific articles. Not the USA Today version of it, but the actual articles themselves. And like I said, we'll be reading articles and even doing our own reports later on in the semester. But you have to actually understand it, not just read somebody else's interpretation of scientific findings. Basically, we're told about science by journalists. That's generally how science is disseminated out into the public. But journalists don't understand this stuff. They're not scientists. As a matter of fact, just recently there was a viral thing going around on the internet where I think this was either CNN or Newsweek. I mean, it wasn't complete tripe, and the headline was "Smelling Farts Cures Cancer," and obviously that's very funny. People went to check it out, and then they followed the link to the actual article, and it had nothing to do with any of that. It was literally talking about a particular enzyme in somebody's intestines that created a gas, and this helped prevent cancer. The gas never escaped the body. It was an internal thing. You have lots of fluids and gases in your body at all times. So it didn't have anything to do with farting, because the gas never left the body, and it certainly had nothing to do with smelling farts, and it didn't even have anything to do with curing cancer. It just had to do with making it so all the crap that we ate didn't cause cancer. So you really can't trust a lot of what you read. So go to Google Scholar, find out from the horse's mouth if you have any questions. A classic example, getting back to development of infants, is SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Obviously, these aren't any more sudden than any other death. These are just unexplained deaths. Sometimes people die, and babies die more often than anybody else. And there's all these rumors about what causes infant death, and the science is really clear on a lot of these things, but that's not what gets passed out. For example, they found that if you lay a baby on its stomach to sleep, there is a lower chance of SIDS than if you lay the baby on its back to sleep. The babies, they're soothed easier. They like being on their stomach. You'll even notice babies like to be held, and you can just squish them right up to your chest. They just like that sort of thing, especially at very young ages. So the science is very clear on this. Baby face down equals good. On the other hand, that's not what gets out into the public. As of about 4 years ago, I was talking to a social worker in Connecticut, and they said that they were actually told by their supervisors that if somebody is placing the baby face down in the crib, they need to remove that baby from the home. Again, with no evidence whatsoever. This is just what their supervisors were told, because there aren't actually laws or rules on a grand scale on why they remove children from their home. It's quite literally just meetings they have every couple of weeks and decide what their criteria happens to be from what they remember in their bachelor's degree educations from years back. They don't actually read the research. Now, a lot of people take this and they say, well, a few years ago, laying the baby on its stomach was bad. Now it's good. Science is always changing its mind. No, it really doesn't. Science doesn't change its mind about things. We can find out new information. Often what is changing its mind is how much of this actually makes it to the public. And we already had a discussion like this in the discussion forums about like video games and some journalists just flat out not wanting to tell certain scientific knowledge to a community because that's not what they thought the community was ready for. So science is not changing its mind. We're very cut and dry on things. It's what's being told to you guys which seems to keep changing its mind. The last thing I'll go on is a section on ignore it for chapter 4. Don't bother with the physical stuff. This is psychology. Whether or not you know how the eye works doesn't particularly matter. You don't need to know table 4.2. Didn't I mention 4.2 is bad? Okay. Okay, so you might need to know 4.2. I'm using notes that I took about a year ago. But so 4.2 is good because that's just a brief summary of a lot of things. But a lot of the physical things as to specifically how things develop, don't worry about that too much. And the tests, by the way, will be on chapters 4, 5, and 6.